Okay, so welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
Today we are diving into some really recent developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict from early March 2025.
Right.
We've got a pretty wide range of reports and analyses here. We're looking at stuff from the Kyiv Independent, Fox News, Reuters, ABC News, the New York Times, and as always, the great work from the Institute for the Study of War, ISW.
Yep.
And really, what we're trying to do today is kind of pull out like what are the big shifts that are happening right now, and understand the different viewpoints that are kind of shaping this whole situation, and give you a clear picture without getting bogged down in every single detail.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the one that stands out as a key turning point is this temporary suspension of all U.S. military aid to Ukraine.
Okay, yeah, let's
Um,
let's break that down a little bit because that sounds like a pretty big shift.
It is.
What led to this? Our sources are pointing to a pretty tense Oval Office meeting that took place on February 28th. It looks like Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy were both there, along with Vice President Vance.
Right.
And the reports are indicating that President Trump kind of walked away from that meeting with the impression that President Zelenskyy was not ready for peace.
That Oval Office encounter,
Yeah.
I think that seems to have been the catalyst. And following that meeting, we're seeing U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio taking a much more prominent role.
Right.
And his recent statements and diplomatic efforts are really setting the tone for the current U.S. policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the most notable things about Secretary Rubio's recent commentary has been his labeling of the conflict as a proxy war.
Mm-hmm.
He said this in a Fox News interview on March 5th.
Right. And this proxy war framing,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting, especially if we consider President Trump's perspective as relayed by Secretary Rubio, that this is a protracted, stalemated conflict that needs to come to an end.
Right.
The proxy war label, I think, suggests this desire to kind of disengage from what's perceived as like an indirect and potentially indefinite engagement.
Yeah, and Rubio was very direct about this. He flat out said that continuing to arm Ukraine indefinitely, the idea of as much as they need for as long as it takes
Right.
is not a strategy.
Right.
So that's a pretty strong statement, and it really seems to signal a pretty fundamental shift in how at least part of the U.S. administration is viewing this whole path forward.
Yeah, and what's fascinating, I think, is the Kremlin's response to this, because their spokesperson Dmitry Peskov actually agreed with Secretary Rubio's assessment.
Wow.
He said that Moscow views the conflict as one between Russia and the collective West, led by the U.S.
Okay.
So you have this interesting convergence in how both Washington and Moscow are framing this conflict,
Right.
even if their underlying reasons are different. I think it's a very significant point to consider.
Yeah, it really does kind of make you wonder, is there some sort of underlying understanding developing, even if, their goals are still very far apart? So with this proxy war label kind of, now in play, it seems like the focus has really shifted pretty dramatically towards diplomacy, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The Trump administration is really signaling that they're pursuing a negotiated settlement here.
Right.
And Secretary Rubio has been very vocal about the need for both Russia and Ukraine to sit down at the negotiating table and, crucially, to be prepared to make concessions.
Right.
And there have even been some reports that Washington had urged Ukraine not to sabotage these efforts at diplomacy, which really suggests that there's a certain level of urgency and the delicate nature of these initial stages.
Yeah, and this idea of concessions, it's really taking center stage. Secretary Rubio made a pretty big statement on March 10th.
Oh, yeah.
Where he kind of suggested that Ukraine would likely have to make some concessions when it comes to territory that Russia's taken since 2014.
Wow.
As part of any eventual peace agreement.
Yeah.
So that feels like a pretty major shift, from maybe previous U.S. and Ukrainian positions.
It does, and it suggests that there's this movement away from, the kind of maximalist goal of full territorial recovery towards a more pragmatic, even though it's going to be really difficult for Ukraine,
Right.
compromise.
Right.
And Secretary Rubio also explicitly stated that he believes that there is no military solution to this conflict.
Okay.
Because that just further underscores how important it is to find a diplomatic resolution.
And to that point, we are seeing some some pretty high-stakes discussions kind of in the works, right?
Absolutely.
U.S. and Ukrainian officials are supposed to meet in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on Tuesday, March 11th.
Yeah, those talks seem like they're going to be super critical.
Right.
The U.S. really wants to sit down with Ukraine and figure out what concessions they might be willing to entertain.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really direct line of communication at a very, very sensitive time.
Right. And we're actually getting some insight into what Ukraine might bring to the table in those discussions.
Oh, really?
Reports are saying that they're prepared to propose a ceasefire specifically at sea and in the air.
Okay.
And that they'll be strongly advocating for the release of prisoners.
Gotcha.
There's also mention of a potential offer to pause long-range airstrikes and attacks at sea.
Okay, interesting.
So it seems like they're approaching these talks with some, pretty concrete proposals that are, at least aimed at de-escalation.
Right. I think these potential measures from Ukraine, they could be interpreted as, maybe initial steps to try to build confidence and create an environment where, broader negotiations could be possible.
Right.
What's going to be really important to watch is whether the U.S. views these proposals as, a sign that Ukraine's serious about making some more substantial compromises.
Right.
And, of course, how Russia might react to those initial steps.
Okay, now let's kind of go back to the suspension of U.S. aid for a minute, because it's really hard to see this as anything other than, a pretty significant lever that the U.S. is using to influence Ukraine's position.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Don't you think?
Yeah, the temporary halt of all U.S. military aid immediately following that Oval Office meeting sends a very clear and powerful message.
Mm-hmm.
And you combine that with, the reports of the suspension of some intelligence sharing, even though some defense-related intelligence is reportedly still going.
Okay.
It's definitely a significant form of leverage.
Right. And then you have President Trump even saying that the U.S. is just about ready to lift the intelligence freeze.
Right.
So it really does seem like it's directly tied to, progress or the perceived lack thereof in these diplomatic efforts.
Yeah, and Secretary Rubio has been pretty explicit about that connection.
Right.
He said that the pause in military aid could be lifted during these talks if he sees that Ukraine is serious about peace. Oh. But he also, very clearly stated that the U.S. is not going to be giving any military assistance to Russia.
Yeah.
Which is, a pretty important point of clarification.
Right. It's this very delicate balancing act where the U.S. is trying to, kind of incentivize Ukraine to engage in, a real compromise at the negotiating table.
Right.
But also assuring them that, this halting of aid isn't, somehow a sign of support for Russia.
Yeah.
And then, on top of that, you have the official cancellation of a whopping 83% of USA programs.
Yeah, that really emphasizes this shift in the U.S.'s approach to its engagement with Ukraine.
Okay, so how has Ukraine been reacting to all of this increased pressure and this, growing expectation of concessions?
Well, President Zelenskyy has been, very active. He wrote a letter to President Trump expressing his readiness to work towards peace under President Trump's leadership. Yeah. And he really underscored how much Ukraine values U.S. support. Oh. So it seems like a clear attempt to maybe mend any perceived rift and show that they're willing to work with the U.S. on this.
And he also brought up the mineral rights deal again, didn't he?
He did.
Kind of reiterating Ukraine's readiness to sign it?
Yeah, he said that Ukraine's ready to finalize that agreement.
Right.
Which, President Trump has previously said could be compensation for U.S. military support.
Yeah. And
would offer what he called implied security.
Right. So while that deal, which, was supposed to create this long-term economic partnership, it remained unsigned after that Oval Office meeting. Yeah. Secretary Rubio has said that discussions about it are ongoing, although it's not the, main focus of these upcoming talks in Jeddah.
Okay.
And, President Zelenskyy himself has been in Saudi Arabia ahead of these really crucial talks.
Right.
He even met with the Saudi crown prince.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like Ukraine is really trying to be proactive in shaping the diplomatic landscape here and maybe garner some regional support.
Yeah, I think that meeting with the Saudi crown prince could be really important.
Right.
Maybe they're trying to secure broader international backing or explore some, other options for mediation.
Right.
And, we're also seeing these reports that Ukraine, understands how serious this is, and they're prepared to do some difficult things to try to end the conflict or at least pause it.
Okay.
Which suggests that, they recognize the pressure they're under.
Right. But what about Russia's position in all of this?
No.
I mean, we're seeing these potential shifts in the U.S. approach, and Ukraine seems willing to consider some difficult compromises. But what signals are we getting from Moscow?
Well, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, has been very consistent in pointing out that neither Putin nor any Kremlin officials have offered any real concessions as a way to end the invasion. They're still demanding Ukraine's complete capitulation, and they want NATO to basically withdraw from Eastern Europe.
So that paints a pretty stark picture.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is pushing Ukraine towards making compromises, but it doesn't really seem like Russia is showing any flexibility.
Yeah, that's right. This unwillingness to compromise is a major obstacle to, the quick diplomatic solution that the U.S. seems to want. Russia's demands are just so big, it makes it really hard to imagine a negotiated settlement where both sides give something up.
Right, and Secretary Rubio has repeatedly said that he thinks President Trump is in a unique position to bring this war to an end.
Yeah.
What's the reasoning behind that?
I think the argument is that because President Trump already has a relationship with Putin,
right,
and because he sees this conflict as something that's just dragging on and needs to be resolved fast, he had some kind of special leverage. And then you also have the fact that his administration is considering lifting some of the sanctions on Russia that were put in place after the invasion, although at the same time they're also threatening to add more sanctions.
Yeah.
So it's a very, complicated and potentially contradictory approach.
Right. It really does add a lot of uncertainty to the whole situation. And, just to remind everybody listening, the broader international context here is that while a lot of Western partners have given a lot of military aid to Ukraine, no one wants to send troops because they're afraid of making the conflict even bigger.
Right.
Turning it into a war across Europe.
That fear of escalation has been a huge factor in how the world has responded to this conflict.
Yeah.
And I think this shift in U.S. policy has to be understood within that context.
So as we start to kind of wrap up this deep dive into this, incredibly complex situation, what would you say are the most important things for our listeners to take away?
Okay, so the most important things to remember, I think, are first, there's been this really clear shift in U.S. policy towards trying to find a quick diplomatic solution.
Right.
Second, there's a lot of pressure on Ukraine to make concessions, maybe even giving up territory.
Right.
And third, it's really interesting that both the U.S. and Russia are using this proxy war framing, even if they probably have different reasons for doing so.
Right.
But it's important to remember that we're still a long way from a lasting peace agreement.
Right.
Especially because Russia doesn't seem willing to compromise.
Yeah. And as we've been talking about all this, what were some of the things that really stood out to you?
I think the fact that the U.S. is tying the suspension of military aid to Ukraine, making concessions, is huge.
Right.
And I also think it's really significant that both the U.S. and the Kremlin are talking about a proxy war. It suggests that they might be on the same page, at least, about how they understand the conflict.
Right.
And finally, I think we need to pay close attention to how the U.S. is trying to position itself as the key player in negotiating a peace deal.
Right. So as you think about everything we've discussed today, here's something to consider on your own.
Okay.
Given how complicated this conflict is and how different the goals of the main players seem to be, what would a truly sustainable and fair resolution even look like? And how would it affect Ukraine's independence and security in the long run? Yeah.
Especially if territory has to change hands.
Right.
What role would the rest of the world need to play in shaping that future?
Right.
That's something to think about.
Definitely.
And that's where we'll end our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.